good to see you this morning. My name's Hunter. I'm one of the pastors here. It's great to have you with us, especially if you are new, just joining us for the first, second, third time. Especially glad to see you. Summer's typically a season when we see a lot of new people coming through, and so we're glad to have you this morning. Glad that you're here. It's our custom on Sunday mornings to study through a passage of Scripture, and so for the past couple of months, we have been going through the book of Acts, which records the growth and the expansion of the Jesus movement beginning in Jerusalem and expanding throughout the Greco-Roman world. And so today we're going to be in Acts chapter 21. And if you have a Bible, grab it and turn to Acts chapter 21. And if you need a Bible, there are some paperback ones on the ends of your rows, and you can have someone pass that down to you, and you can follow along with us today in Acts chapter 21. You'll find the book of Acts right after the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are the stories of Jesus' life, his biographies. And then comes the book of Acts, which Luke tells us at the very beginning. Luke is our author. He also wrote the Gospel of Luke. He tells us at the very beginning, it's an account of everything that Jesus continued after his resurrection to do and to teach. We're going to be in Acts chapter 21. We're going to look at verses 15 to 26 today. And in the second half of this book, we are particularly tracing the ministry of the Apostle Paul. Paul, more than anyone else, was responsible, humanly speaking, for the growth and the expansion of the gospel of Jesus throughout the Greco-Roman world. And so we're tracing his ministry in the second half of this book, and we're learning that over and over and over again, patterns in Paul's life serve as examples to us of what it looks like to become a Christian and then to live as a disciple of Jesus. In fact, Paul frequently holds himself up as an example. You'll find this if you read many of the letters he wrote that are also recorded in your New Testament. For example, in the book of Philippians, in chapter 3, he is writing to young Christians, urging them to endure in their faithfulness with Jesus, even though it's difficult, even though it's hard, even though it's costly for them. And here's what he tells them in Philippians chapter 3, verse 17. He says, "Brothers, join in imitating me and keep your eyes on those who walk according to the example you have in us." He's talking about him and his band of co-workers. He says the same thing in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. This time he's urging young Christians to get a job and to work hard, and he's holding himself up as an example of how to do that. He says, "You yourselves know how you ought to imitate us, because we were not idle when we were with you, nor did we eat anyone's bread without paying for it. But with toil and labor we worked night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you. It was not because we do not have the right, but to give you in ourselves an example to imitate." So Paul holds himself up as an example of what it looks like to follow Jesus. He says the same thing in 1 Timothy, a letter he wrote to a young pastor that he left at the biggest church he planted in the city of Ephesus. And he holds himself up in 1 Timothy as an example of what it looks like to believe in Jesus and to become a Christian. He says the saying is trustworthy and deserving of full acceptance, that Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the foremost. But I received mercy for this reason, that in me, as the foremost, Jesus Christ might display his perfect patience as an example to those who were to believe in him for eternal life. He says, look at me. If you're wondering if you are beyond the reach of God's grace, look at me and the condition I was in. I'm an example. And so the point in all of this is that Paul's life is frequently held up as an example to imitate, to look to, and to learn from. He's an example of what it looks like to bear the cost of following Jesus. He's an example of what it looks like to work hard. He's an example of what it even looks like to become a Christian, to receive God's grace through Jesus. And so we have been seeing that as we go through Acts, that in many ways, Paul's life serves as a pattern. And I tell you all of that because today we are going to see, I think, one of the wisest examples that Paul sets for us. And yet, I'll also warn you that the passage we are getting ready to look at is not immediately obvious how it applies to us or what it could possibly mean for us or how this could possibly be any kind of example that we should follow. It's very easy when we read this passage we're getting ready to look at to skip right past it because it's kind of strange, it's kind of foreign to us, and just to assume that this is not really anything we need to spend much time on. In fact, before I teach any sermon in weeks leading up to, as I'm studying and preparing, I often listen to other people preach the passage I'm going to preach just to see how they handle it, see what I can learn from other people. I have no real original thoughts or ideas. And you should not want me to. The minute I have an original thought, I'm probably wrong. And so you should not want me to have original thoughts and ideas. And so I try very hard to be unoriginal. And so I listen to other faithful teachers preach, and almost all of them that I listen teach, they apologize for even preaching this passage because they talk about how strange it is. Well, I'm not going to apologize to you because I think, though it is strange, Paul actually sets one of the wisest examples that we can learn from his life. In fact, he is going to show off in this passage a level of wisdom that I think most Christians, not just young Christians, not just Christians today, most Christians never grow into. Most people who follow Jesus stop somewhere short of learning what Paul seems to have learned, and we're going to see it on display today. Now, to understand what we're going to see, you need to know about a controversy that was simmering and festering in the early Christian movement. You know, for the last 2,000 years, there have always been controversies at particular times within the broader Christian movement about who Jesus is and who he isn't, and what kinds of teaching are faithful to the original message of Jesus and what kinds aren't. And our generation in particular really doesn't like controversy, and so this can make us very uneasy. And yet sometimes it is painfully necessary that the church hash these things out in order to maintain the teaching and the gospel that Jesus delivered to us. And so the very first controversy, as controversies go, it was occurring all throughout Paul's ministry, and it went something like this. The question was, what is absolutely necessary in order to be a Christian? What is the bottom line, bare minimum, gotta have it? In particular, the question took this form. If you become a Christian, given that Jesus was Jewish, given that all of the original followers of Jesus were Jewish, if you become a Christian, do you have to also become Jewish? Do you have to also learn to live like a Jew? Now that seems trivial, I know, to us, but it was a very big deal back then, and the Apostle Paul was at the center of this controversy. In fact, it was Paul's ministry that originally provoked and raised these questions to the surface because he was the very first person to begin bringing massive numbers of Gentiles, non-Jews, to faith in Jesus. In fact, if you were with us back when we studied Acts chapter 15, we saw this controversy bubble up for the first time. And here's how it went. Paul and his friends Barnabas and some of his traveling companions had been spreading the gospel of Jesus to non-Jewish peoples. They were based out of a city called Antioch, which was a fair bit north of Jerusalem. That was kind of their home base, and from there they were doing missions, and a number of Gentiles were coming to faith in Jesus. And then this controversy bubbled to the surface, and here's how it's recorded for us in Acts 15. But some men came down from Judea. That's where Jerusalem was located. That's where the original Christian church was. Some men came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers in Antioch, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, which was the distinctive Jewish identity marker, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. And after Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and debate with them, Paul and Barnabas and some of the others were appointed to go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and the elders about this question. And so the early church just began to hash out this question. Do you have to become Jewish in order to become a Christian? Do you have to join the Moses Club before you join the Jesus Club? If you become a Christian, is there something else that you need to add beyond just Jesus? And Paul's answer to this question was consistently and emphatically no. He saw very clearly what was at stake in this debate. And he said the very essence of the gospel was at stake in this debate. And his reasoning went something like this. All of us are sinful, no matter if we're Jew or Gentile, no matter if we're male or female, no matter if we're religious or irreligious, no matter if we're Jerusalem citizens or Roman citizens, or Americans or Denverites or even Texans. We're all sinful. We're all sinful, and therefore we have no claim to standing with God. We have no claim on our own merit of standing. And so all of us, no matter where we come from, no matter what our background, no matter if we grow up in church or outside of church, All of us, no matter our background, we start on the same place. We are all sinners who are beggars for mercy at God's feet. And that mercy is found in Jesus. It's found through what Jesus did for us on the cross, taking our sin to the cross on our behalf. It's found in Him raising from the dead to conquer our sin and conquer death, and that mercy is found in Jesus. So if we all start at the same point, then we all have to access God in the same way, which is through Jesus. And that's it. And Paul saw that very clearly. So you have to come through Jesus. And so he said, if you start teaching people that you come to Jesus, but you also have to become Jewish, then you're obscuring grace, and you're obscuring the centrality of Jesus. You're suggesting that it's Jesus plus Jewishness that saves when it's really just Jesus. You're suggesting that some people are more qualified to know God based on their background, based on their religious upbringing, based on their ethnicity, when in reality, none of us are qualified in and of ourselves, and we can all be qualified simply on the basis of Jesus. So Paul saw this more clearly than anyone else. And so when this controversy first flared up, they go to Jerusalem, they discuss it with the apostles and the leaders of the church there in Jerusalem, and they come to agreement. They come to agreement that salvation is through grace in Jesus, that it's not necessary to require Gentile converts to also be circumcised and live like Jews, because salvation is through grace, not through Jewishness. And so they became very clear on this. We saw this reconciled in Acts chapter 15, and yet here's the thing. Even though they settled the question there as leaders, some people didn't give up the fight. Some continued to insist that you have to be and become Jewish and live like a Jew, even if you're a Gentile. In fact, these people were so adamant that they would evidently follow Paul around from city to city. And when Paul would go in and preach the gospel and establish a church, when he would leave, they would come in behind him and they would say, hey, there's something Paul didn't tell you. I know he told you about grace and about Jesus and about believing in Jesus and being baptized in identity with Jesus, but you're also going to need a surgery in order to be a Christian. And so they just began to tell this. And so Paul was constantly dealing with this issue throughout his ministry. This controversy dogged him his entire ministry. And here's what I want you to see this morning. On this question, Paul never wavered. He was firm, he was fixed, he was inflexible, he was stubborn about this. He would fight you about this. Paul would not yield an inch on this question. Salvation is through grace, which is found in Jesus and nothing else. And he never wavered on that. In fact, one of the letters in your New Testament, a few pages after the book of Acts, is Paul's letter to the Galatians. Galatia was a region in which Paul had established churches, and after he left, some people came in, and they began to teach the Galatians that you have to have a surgery and become Jewish. And so Paul writes a letter back to this church to remind them of what the gospel really is. And I just want to read a couple of snippets from this letter because it illustrates how firm and inflexible and unyielding Paul was on this issue. Just listen to this theme. For example, in Galatians chapter 1, verse 6, here's what he writes to them. I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. He said, this is not even the same thing. It's a different gospel. Not that there is another one. I mean, there's no other gospel that saves, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. Now let that sink in. Paul's saying, if I ever come back and preach a different gospel from the one I preached to you, just assume that original me was right and new me is wrong. I have gone off the rails somewhere. Even if I deny the gospel I originally preached to you, even if I go, guys, I was wrong about this, I've got some changes, don't believe me. That's what he's saying. Or if an angel of heaven should preach to you a different gospel, if an angel in all her splendor should descend to you and preach a different gospel, tell that angel that he or she is a fool. In fact, let him be accursed. That means go to hell. Verse 9. You think he was a little bit riled up about this? Verse 9, as we have said before, like just a verse earlier, so I say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you received, let him be accursed. Paul was firm and unyielding on this question. He says again in Galatians chapter 2, verse 4, he's recounting his experience with these false teachers, and he's telling them, I resist them steadily. He says in verse 4, yet because of false brothers secretly brought in who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus, so they might bring us into slavery, to them we did not yield in submission even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. Later on in that chapter, he's going to recount an incident in which Peter, who was the original leader of the Jesus movement, in which Peter got confused on this issue. And Paul's going to say, even if I have to go toe-to-toe with Peter, I'll take him on. Chapter 2, verse 11, but when Cephas, that was another name for Peter, when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, James is the leader of the church in Jerusalem, he was eating with the Gentiles, but when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas, that's Paul's co-worker, was led astray by their hypocrisy. All his friends are now going along with this. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? So here's the pattern. If I change my message, don't believe it. If an angel from the Lord changes, gives you a different message, don't believe it. If Peter, the original leader of the Jesus movement, preaches another gospel, I'll oppose him to his face. Paul was firm. He was unyielding. He was inflexible on this issue. He never yielded an inch. And this controversy festered throughout his whole ministry. You got the picture? Okay, now you're ready to see what's going on in Acts chapter 21. And when we come to Acts chapter 21, Paul is in the final days of his ministry. These are going to be the last days he's going to spend as a free man. He has done his last missionary journey. He has started his last church, and he has spent the last few weeks en route to Jerusalem. He is taking money, a financial offering that he has collected from all the churches he pastors. He has taken an offering from these churches, and he is bringing it to Jerusalem to relieve famine that was happening in Jerusalem. He's going to serve the Christians in Jerusalem with money that he's collected mostly from Gentiles. He's doing this as a tangible demonstration of the unity of Jewish and Gentile Christians, that they take care of one another. So he's en route to Jerusalem with this offering, and today he's going to arrive finally in Jerusalem. And when he arrives, the remnants of this controversy are going to come up again. And here's what I want you to watch for. I want you to watch for how Paul reacts to the controversy resurfacing, because his reaction is, one, surprising, and secondly, has a lesson for us about what maturity as a follower of Jesus looks like. Pick it up in verse 15. After these days, we got ready and went up to Jerusalem. And some of the disciples from Caesarea went with us, bringing us to the house of Mnason of Cyprus, an early disciple with whom we should lodge. One of the original disciples of Jesus lived there on the outskirts of Jerusalem. His name was Mnason. Turns out, Mnason is actually my first name, and I had no idea until this week that it was in the Bible. So, take that, all you Joshuas and Calebs and Davids and Peters. I have a Bible name too, turns out. Verse 17, when we had come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. Now, James was the leader at this point of the church in Jerusalem. He was the half-brother of Jesus, and James was known for his wisdom. In fact, back in Acts chapter 15, when this controversy first bubbled to the surface and they went to Jerusalem to talk about this, James sided with Paul. And James said, you do not have to live like a Jew in order to be a Christian. And he extended fellowship and friendship to Paul. And even though it was often difficult, even though Paul was often misunderstood, James and Paul had a good relationship. And so Paul, when he gets to Jerusalem, goes in to see James, and all the elders were present. Verse 19. After greeting them, he related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. It probably took a while if he related it one by one. And when they heard it, they glorified God, and they said to him, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed." And so these guys are just trading war stories, and Paul is telling them about the many thousands of Gentiles who have believed in Jesus. And James says, and in fact, the mission in Jerusalem by the church in Jerusalem to help Jewish people come to see that Jesus is their Messiah, it is also bearing a lot of fruit. And many thousands of Jews have come to faith in Jesus. But now this old controversy is going to bubble back up to the surface. Second half of verse 20. Many thousands there are among the Jews who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. And they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. So James says, hey, Paul, I just need to let you know something here. There's a rumor being circulated about you in the city. In fact, you're not too popular here. You don't have a great reputation here because people here think that you teach Jewish people that when they become Christians, they should then no longer circumcise their children or practice our customs. And even among the Christian population, Paul, you don't have a great reputation here in Jerusalem. Now, this was a crooked understanding of what Paul actually taught. It was not completely accurate. Paul taught that Gentiles did not need to practice circumcision or live according to the Jewish customs. He didn't necessarily teach this to Jewish converts. With Jews, he was much more open-handed, and he would have said, follow the ancestral customs if you want to. You don't necessarily have to if you're living among Gentiles. And so he would have said this was simply a matter of conscience for Jewish folks. Do what you want to do. But he certainly didn't teach them and exhort them to no longer circumcise their children and forsake the law of Moses. He was neutral on this. But the Jerusalem folks would not have understood and did not understand all of that nuance. And so James is saying, hey, Paul, your presence here puts us in kind of a tough spot because you don't have a great reputation in the city. Verse 22. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. Subtext, and there could be trouble when they find out that you've come. Verse 23, do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself also live in observance of the law. But as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols and from blood and from what has been strangled and from sexual immorality. And he's referring there back to the letter they crafted in Acts chapter 15. So here's what James says. James has a solution for how they can navigate this controversy and help people see that Paul is not the person that they think he is. And here's how it goes. According to Jewish law, a person could go into a special season of purification where they would live for a season of dedicated, extra careful, ritualistic duty to remain ritually clean. This would have been outlined in Numbers chapter 6. It was called taking a vow. And so, according to their law, a Jewish person could do that, especially they would do it when they had spent a period of time outside of Israel and would have been considered unclean or have had contact with unclean people. And so they could, when they re-entered Jewish society, they could take a vow and enter a period. It would usually last 30 days of special purification to show how dedicated they were. And during this 30 days, they wouldn't even shave their head, wouldn't even get a haircut because the process of getting a haircut could make them unclean. So here's how it would go. At the beginning of the 30 days, they would go to the temple and they would post notice with the temple authorities they were entering a vow. And then they would live this out for 30 days. And at the end of that 30 days, they would go back to the temple. They would make a financial offering as a way of concluding their period of vow. And then they would shave their head to conclude it. Now, that was a common Jewish practice. And so whether you understand all the stuff about purification and vows and laws and rituals and head shavings and all that, here's what you need to see. James was asking Paul to voluntarily live according to the Jewish law and take on a Jewish custom, and in fact, to go along with these men who were doing this in order to demonstrate that he's still willing to live under the Jewish law. So James says we have 4 men who are under a vow. And by 4 men, he means we have 4 Jewish Christians who are under this vow. He says, so here's what you should do, Paul. It's probably nearing the conclusion of their period of purification. You should go along for the rest of their period of purification. Then when it's time for them to go to the temple and pay and make their offering and shave their head, you should go with them and pay for them. Use this money you've brought and go pay for them to do this, so that you can demonstrate, as a way of demonstrating that you're still willing to live under the Jewish law. Now, here's the question. How is Paul going to react to this proposal? And keep in mind who we are dealing with here. We're dealing with the firm, inflexible, stubborn, willing to fight over whether you have to live as a Jew in order to be saved guy. That's who we're dealing with here. How do you think he is going to react to this proposal that it's necessary for him to go and live like a Jew in order to smooth over this controversy? Verse 26. Then Paul took the men, and the next day he purified himself along with them, and he went into the temple, giving notice when the days of purification will be fulfilled and the offering presented for each one of them. And if you know anything about Paul, here's what you should be surprised about. He went along with this proposal. He didn't fight this time. Now remember, I told you back at the very beginning, Paul has some wisdom that I think most Christians never attain to. Paul has some of the most nuanced and sophisticated wisdom that I think most of us never learn. And here's how it goes. Paul was able to be both stubborn and flexible. He could be unwavering and accommodating. Both postures, see, were in his repertoire. And the wisdom went like this. He knew exactly when to be stubborn. He knew exactly when to fight. He knew exactly when to argue. And he knew when to be accommodating. And he knew when to be flexible. And he knew when to go along. And he knew when not to fight. And maturing in the gospel is not necessarily being stubborn or flexible. It's having both at your disposal and knowing when to use which. In fact, Paul wrote in his letters just as much about his flexibility as he did about his stubbornness. Listen, for example, to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 and following. He says, "For though I'm free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not myself being under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak, I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. Now here he is just outlining and describing for us exactly what we saw him practicing in Acts 21. He says, to the Jew, I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. In other words, when I am with Jewish people, I live like a Jewish person. To those under the law, I became as one under the law. When I'm with Jews who are zealous for the law, I observe it in all its detail, just like he's doing in Acts 21. Then he adds a parenthetical note, though not myself being under the law. In other words, not because I have to. In fact, there were many times when Paul didn't live according to Jewish law. So not because I have to, but because I want to and I'm willing to, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, now he's talking about Gentiles. I become as one outside the law. In other words, when I'm with Gentiles, I live as much like a Gentile as I can. Then he adds a parenthetical note, not being outside the law of Christ, but under the law of Christ. And by this he means I don't live immorally when I'm among the Gentiles. So if they're having orgies, I don't have an orgy. I don't participate. If they are going to a swingers convention, I don't go to the swingers convention. If they're getting high, I'm not getting high. But otherwise, I'm right there with them, hanging out with them as much as I can, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak, I become weak. And so Paul is not only inflexible, he's also at times very accommodating. And the question is, how did he know when to be firm? And how did he know when to be flexible? And it all depended on what was at stake in his firmness or his flexibility. When the content of the gospel was at stake, when the essence of the gospel was at stake, Paul would stand all by himself if he had to. He was that firm. And when the content of the gospel was not at stake, but relationships with people and the unity of the church was, Paul was flexible and Paul was adaptable. And he had both in his repertoire. Now let me just be as blunt as I can. This is almost the exact opposite of what many Christians practice today. We are almost taught to elevate our cultural preferences to the level of things to be fought over, and yet often we're rather unwilling to be very contentious about the essential truthfulness and claims of the gospel. In fact, our society kind of pushes us in that direction because we always have two things being whispered in our ear. One thing being whispered in our ear goes like this: you have preferences, you have things that you like, and those need to be fought for. In fact, you're owed those things. In fact, you need those things. And so it's almost comical sometimes how many trivial preferences I'm willing to argue over. It's almost comical sometimes how firm in my convictions I am about preferences. I like Target. I'm not so sure about Walmart. I think the Mexican food in Denver is terrible. I think barbecue ought to only be pork and should never be made by people from England or Minnesota. That eliminates the two biggest barbecue chains in our city. Brothers Barbecue is British guys. You should not go there. Famous Dave's Barbecue is from Minnesota. You should not go there. I don't understand the Mumford & Sons craze. I think the Braves need a center fielder and a right-handed bat. I'm firm and convinced about all of these things, right? And because our culture offers me so much information and so many choices and so many options and experience, it almost conditions me to be dogmatic about these things and develop firm convictions about almost every little thing in our world. And yet, you know what else it whispers in my ear? It whispers that I should be tolerant and vague and inconclusive on matters of universal truth and importance. I should be firm about barbecue and baseball, but Jesus and the gospel, don't be so dogmatic about all that eternal salvation stuff. And so this is how Twitter serves me. If you go read my Twitter feed, this is where I broadcast my opinions about things that don't matter. Now, when this bleeds into the church, and culture always, in fact, if you're in a good church, culture is washing back into it because real people from the world are in the church. And so, but when this bleeds back into a church, here's what begins to happen. We can debate and we can discuss our preferences about the style of music that's played. We can debate and discuss our preferences about Christians and their views of politics and whether we should be left or whether we should be right. We can be firm in recycling and carbon footprints, but we're hesitant to say that anyone's theological ideas about the gospel might be true or false. So you know right where we stand on recycling, but you're not real sure what we think the gospel is and isn't. You know right where we stand on political issues, but you're not real sure what we think it means to actually believe in and have faith in Jesus. And Paul's life would challenge us. And it would say there's some things that are worth being firm and fixed about. And there's some things that you could have your preferences, but you should be flexible. I would eat bad barbecue to hang out with any of you. I would let a couple of pasty British guys roast a pig, put ketchup on it, and I would call it barbecue to spend time with any of you guys. Because I'm learning to be a flexible man. I could disagree with any of you on the political issues of the day, if we can talk about the gospel. In fact, here's what Paul's life would say to us. When you are firm and you are fixed and you have strong dogmatic opinions about secondary things, but you're shifty and you're inconclusive and you're vague and you're hesitant to make a call on the important things of the gospel, your life will become trivial. But when you are firm and when you are fixed and when you are willing to stand on the things that are important and central, and you are flexible on things that are not as important, then your life is weighty and it's influential. And this is a level of wisdom that many Christians never attain to. That we need to be both firm and flexible, that we need to have both in our bag of tricks, and we need to be firm on the right things and flexible on the right things. That being firm is going to often be costly, and being flexible will often feel costly because we'll be going along with things that are not our preference, but are nonetheless not essential. But if you will follow Paul's example, the gospel will free you from triviality and will make your life weighty and important and influential. Now, lastly, what if you're just encountering Jesus and you're like, man, that's great to have all this advanced wisdom that most Christians never attain to, but man, I'm just trying to figure this Jesus out. I don't need the AP stuff right now. I just need the basics, right? What would this say to you? Well, if you have a genuine encounter with Jesus, you will find that he has both firmness and flexibility in his bag of tricks. You will find that Jesus is very flexible and very accommodating in connecting with people. He does not care. He does not care if you are religious or irreligious. He does not care if you grew up in church or you didn't grow up in church. He doesn't care if you're a squeaky, clean, living person or if you couldn't even get here this morning because you're still hungover from last night and Friday night and Thursday night. He could not care less. He could not care less if you're a virgin or if you have had sex with 40 people. He could not care less when it comes to connecting with you. In fact, this is what often got Jesus in hot water with religious people. He was way too flexible for them. Do you know what they said about him? He eats with tax collectors and sinners. To share a meal with someone in Jesus' day was a sign of friendship. He goes into their homes and sits down and eats dinner with them. He was way too flexible for the religious folks of his day. And so if any of you think, well, Jesus would never have anything to do with me, you're wrong. If Jesus was physically right here with us, you know what he would do? He would be pursuing friendship with you. He'd be building as much common ground as he could. He would not come off as a stuffy religious guy who simply couldn't relate to you. He would go as far as he could to build common ground with you. And yet, here's what the folks who became friends with Jesus also discovered. There were some things that Jesus could be and was and is very firm about. He is very firm that we are sinful. Though he is very flexible in connecting with us, he is very firm in not affirming everything we do and think and believe. Jesus never told people, oh, you're fine just like you are. I'm just here to tell you that. He would be very firm in insisting that you're sinful, that you are separated from God, and that you need to be reconciled to God. He'd be very firm in that. In fact, he was so firm in that he went to the cross, overcoming all kinds of temptations and opportunities to opt out. He went to the cross and he used his firmness and he used his stubbornness and he used his conviction and he used his clarity to lay down and get nailed to a couple of boards. Because of his unwavering commitment to the fact that you need a Savior. Because of his unwavering commitment to the fact that your sin needs to be atoned for. Because of his unwavering commitment to providing grace for you. And so if you have a genuine encounter with Jesus, and if you have an encounter with someone who looks more and more and more like Jesus as his follower, you will not be able to peg them as dogmatic on all matters, nor will you be able to pin them down as wishy-washy, everything's okay people. But you will find this wise, sweet mix of flexibility and firmness. And it's that ability of Jesus to connect with us and then to firmly challenge us and then to die for us that saves us. And so all who are being transformed in his image should be the same. Let's pray. Father, I want to thank you for this strange episode in Paul's life that illustrates what he preached, that he became all things to all people in order that he might win some. And I thank you that in going along with this little scheme that James cooked up, Paul was not giving in, but he was going as far as he could possibly go to show his Jewish friends the gospel of Jesus. And I thank you that he was also firm on grace. He was firm on the necessity of believing in Jesus and nothing else. And if he had not been firm on that, none of us would be here. And so we thank you that this man knew exactly when to fight, exactly when to argue, and exactly when to flex and bend and accommodate. And I pray that we would learn the same thing, which ultimately he learned from Jesus. We ask it in his name and by the Spirit. Amen.